Hi, I'm Dave Eicher, editor of Astronomy magazine. Welcome to the second to the last Cosmos Rewind Google Hangout. I can't believe it. It's all gone so quickly. Sponsored by Celestron, the telescope company we really like. This past episode of Cosmos, a SpaceTime Odyssey, was called The World Set Free, and it explored the many ideas surrounding global warming. Let me, before we get going, introduce our distinguished panel of editors who have joined us once again today. April Reese, Associate Editor of Discover. April, thanks for joining us today. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, thank you. Corey Powell, as always, Editor-at-Large of Discover. How you doing, Corey, today?
Large and somewhat in charge.
Excellent. That sounds good. Lisa Raffensperger, Associate Editor of Discover. Great to have you back, Lisa.
Yeah, it's nice to be here again.
And Rich Talcott, Senior Editor of Astronomy magazine, who has been at the magazine with me for many years, and myself. So it's nice to be with all of you. And before we start off our discussion of global warming, which no doubt will lead in many different directions, Lisa, you're going to give us an episode summary to describe specifically what Neil talked about.
Yeah, just as a refresher, if you watched it a couple days ago. So, yeah, Dave, like you said, the episode centers around global warming and is much less linear and a lot more kind of cyclical in its exploration. But we start with the really striking image of this perfect planet gone terribly wrong, and that turns out to be Venus, which is called up again and again as this parallel of what could happen to our lovely Earth, and we've got it so good. And then Neil goes on to talk about how, you know, on Earth the difference is that most of our carbon is sequestered away. We see the White Cliffs of Dover. He talks about Charles David Keeling and the Keeling curve, which is super famous by now, and sort of the climbing concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. We talked about ice cores and how we can tell the composition of ancient atmospheres based on the bubbles in ice that we, you know, go miles below the surface of Greenland to drill up. He went into some basic science of how an energy balance works. So the energy that comes into the Earth, when it bounces off, then at that layer the greenhouse gases keep it as a blanket against the Earth. And he says there's nothing controversial about it. It's simply bookkeeping. And that's kind of a theme throughout, that this is all really settled science. He takes down the idea that it could be volcanic emissions. He takes down the idea that it could be changes in solar output. He does that demonstration of weather versus climate with him walking the dog, which I think we'll talk about, but that was a nice image. And then we go, you know, he says the sun isn't the problem, it could be a solution. And so then we go into solutions. Solar energy is one that he spends a lot of time on, including going to the Paris World's Fair and then to this demonstration of kind of industrial scale solar power in Egypt. We talk just for like 10 seconds about wind power, and that's our alternative energy roundup. And then the image he conjures at the end is of the Cold War, and he says that some of our greatest achievements have come out of our darkest moments, and really very strongly compares the situation we're in now to the space race and how, you know, we kind of rose above, despite that not being really for scientific or altruistic reasons. Yeah, and then we end with that vision of these like futuristic utopian cities that, you know, that have green roofs and vertical space and you know, that's our moon race right there. Yeah, that's what we have in front of us, and I'm sure we'll talk about all of that in more detail.
And he left us with the words of JFK, so many years ago in 1961 with the space race and the reason why we should aspire to great things. So should we be aspiring to much more than is happening now with the issue of climate change and global warming? What did you think of this episode overall?
Well, I'll jump in. I thought it was a really well done episode. I thought in some ways it was the most focused of the Cosmos episodes, perhaps of the whole set. It really tied together two messages very tightly. One, the message of sort of our place in the universe, of the Earth's environment as a product of where we are as a planet and sort of where we are in space, and then the second part of that, which is once you understand our place in the universe, you understand basically what is precarious about it. That there's a very specific chemical balance and energy balance that we have on our planet, and when you alter that, you alter the planet. And I think that, then the closing message of what we do about that, I think that that all came together in a very organic way, and I think what I was impressed with about this episode was that it was not particularly alarmist in its tone, but was very methodical and sort of spelling out what is happening, how do we know that humans are contributing to it, and then what do we do about it? Because I think that last part, I think that there's some people who there are all kinds of reasons why people don't believe in global warming, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute. I think there are also a lot of people who accept the idea that it's happening, but tune out because it just seems so big and so hopeless. Like, how are you ever going to deal with this? I think the idea that it is a challenge that can bring out the best in us, rather than a challenge that is so daunting that we'd rather just not even think about it and let somebody else deal with it later. That psychologically, I think that's an incredibly powerful way to reframe it. So I was impressed with this episode.
How did the rest of you feel? Did you like it? I liked it a lot. I thought it was very solid, and I thought again, we've sort of given up on feeling like well, astronomy is in the last generation of astronomical research is not really being focused on a whole lot in this series, which is a little surprising. But that issue set aside, Earth is a planet too, as they say, and I think it was really well done overall. And I agree, Corey, the treatment of it was very rational and consciously avoided emotion and getting entangled in the politics of it and stuck with the data. And of course, those data are very, very clear. If you believe in science, if you believe in scientific thinking, you have to believe in science and empiricism all the time, not part of the time. And that means whether you like it or not, accepting that global warming is a scientific fact. So I thought the episode was really, really well done. I thought it was a little bit curious, and I know, Rich, you're going to talk about this a little bit as well. I thought it was funny that the sort of assumption that Venus, the early history of Venus, was sort of, something akin to a paradise like Earth with liquid oceans, that was sort of taken on faith. And in fact, we don't know that early Venus had liquid oceans, or that it was a very, very nice place at all, frankly, because Venus globally resurfaced on the scale of somewhere between 3 and 750 million years ago or so. Globally, it's the planet that volcanically erupted all over itself. Venus, the planet that threw up on itself. So it's really covered the geological history of the first couple billion years when it is quite possible that liquid oceans existed, but we really don't know, and the evidence is very thin and comes from ratios of deuterium to hydrogen and so on, and so it's really very preliminary to talk about Venus being an Earth-like planet early in its history. We just don't know that. But that set aside, which I don't think you had to use in your arsenal. It is obviously a planet that went through catastrophic carbon dioxide dominated global warming, and the same lesson applies to us, as well. So I thought it was a great episode as well.
Well, I just think too, I think this is a really complex topic, and it's hard to make it real to people, but I feel like you know, he did a really good job of bringing it home and actually going out into the field and showing examples of what's happening now, because a lot of people have been thinking climate change is something that's going to happen way off in the future, but you know, like that last IPCC report and the U.S. climate assessment that just came out, both state really firmly that it's already happening. And so I think it was a really good idea for him to go to the Arctic and show, you know, the erosion of the coastline there. And I think, I forget exactly what he said, but it was something about, you know, how much has changed since he was born. I'm not sure how old he is, but I think that really drove home that in a very short time frame we're seeing huge changes, and this is just the beginning of a really disastrous future. And this is probably one of the biggest issues of our time. But it's really hard since, as he said, CO2, the main greenhouse gas, is invisible. It's really hard to bring home to people. So one of my favorite parts of the episode was actually the purple haze part. I call it the purple haze after Jimi Hendrix, little nod to Jimi Hendrix there. But I thought that was a great way to make it real to people too, is, you know, showing that mock-up of a city with the purple, you know, making the gas purple. And if we could see it, like he said, things would probably be a lot different on the policy front right now.
Yeah, I agree that was really effective. Sorry, Rich. I'll go fast and I'll let you have yours too. I thought the purple was really effective, and the places where they departed from kind of to me, we were trotting a lot of familiar ground, and I know that's not the case for all viewers of Cosmos, and so, but I did get excited where we kind of deviated from that narrative, and I thought the purple part was one of it, and I thought the fact that we went to see permafrost, which isn't maybe like the most like photogenic. It's not ice caps. You know, we didn't see any charismatic megafauna, but it was nice to have to be a bit different in the ways that we were kind of visualizing the effects of climate change. And so I agree with April that was a really nice part where we saw the crumbling permafrost.
And he offered a message of hope at the end too, which I was kind of surprised to see, and also really glad to see, because a lot of even the best stories about climate change leave you feeling pretty hopeless, like Corey mentioned a minute ago. And so I thought it was also really effective, because you do want to give people a sense of hope that there are things we can do, which is true. And, you know, everything points, all the data point to the urgency of actually taking action. That's going to take not just government action, but individual action. And we'll get into that more in a bit. I think that was one of the questions raised by the audience and sent to us. But just, you know, showing that sustainable city of the future with the green roofs and the solar panels, and just putting an actual image in people's head of what things could be compared to what they are now was, I think, a really clever and smart thing to do that leaves people with a sense of hope. And also juxtaposing JFK's words about we're gonna, you know, from the moon effort, something about, you know, it's going to be hard. So getting across the point that this isn't going to be easy, but look, we've overcome these huge obstacles before, and because of our ingenuity and our will, we can do it if we work together. So.
I want to jump in for just 1 second. I'm Rich. I apologize. I will let you. I will let you have your say. Yeah. Enjoy. Have a drink. So, you know, one thing. You know, and Neil Tyson has talked a lot about the fact that the Apollo program was really, it was a military program more than a scientific program. That, you know, the space race was inspired by missile technology and by the sense of, you know, of competing technologically and militarily with the Soviets, not by a sense that, you know, we have to go and see what the moon is made of and figure out how it formed. You know, it was fundamentally, it was a military imperative that produced some scientific objectives, and I thought, you know, that message that he's talked about before was adapted in a really interesting way in this episode. Remembering that the Apollo program, although it was an incredible scientific achievement, was an expression, you know, it was taking a military concern, was basically a concern about an existential concern about survival, and making something dramatic and positive out of it. And so, the idea that we went to the moon, in a sense, out of fear, and we turned it into this amazing achievement, and making that parallel between climate change, that here's something where there's another existential threat, there's another thing that inspires fear, and that the response to that could instead be something very positive, that we take this as, this is another huge technological challenge, this is another, this is our ingenuity is on the line, and the result can be something really spectacular. And again, I think, back to April's point, that really takes, it takes a message of anxiety and hopelessness and turns it around and says, no, actually, I'm putting this to you as a challenge of how do we live a better life. And when you actually talk to climate scientists, that's the message that I hear over and over again. And I think that the public tends only to hear the anxiety side of the message from the climate scientists. But the reason that people get so worked up about this is they want to make the world better. They want to convince people that we have to take action and make positive change. So anything that can help sort of reframe sort of despair and inaction into a call to, a challenge to action and positive advancement, I think is a very valuable thing. And I'm going to stay quiet. I'm really going to let Rich talk. I promise.
Thanks. Well, I could probably just say that I agree, and that would pretty much summarize my feelings. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that I feel a little bit set free by Cosmos now that I've given up on it being something about the most recent results of the last 35 years in astronomy, and that it's not going to get there. And so I've been set free to enjoy the episodes on a case-by-case basis, and not necessarily where I think it should go, but basically what it is. And I thought in that sense the global warming episode really worked well, because it talked about things that are important, did it in a very linear and obvious way, and you can't help but like the dog on the beach along with Neil, showing the difference between weather and climate. And I may not totally agree with Neil that climate is 100% predictable, but it's certainly more predictable than the weather out 10 or 20 days from now. So I think Neil did a very good job in discussing global warming, and I guess that's about it.
Yeah, Rich, I'm glad you brought up the 100% predictability of climate. I was actually surprised that he framed it that way, because climate models are inherently not 100% accurate. They're models, and even though they're improving in accuracy, I was kind of surprised at the language. Even though I really appreciated the man and dog on the beach analogy, I thought that was a really clever way of driving that hugely important point home, because people who don't know much about climate change and the science and aren't well informed, I even have relatives who have said, well, for this climate change thing, I don't really believe in it because it snowed here yesterday, So I think it was really important to point that out. At the same time, I think it was a little bit of a simplification, because climate does have an effect on weather. Like, we're going to see more extreme flooding events and more extreme heat events, and like in 2012, it was the warmest year on record, and we had a lot of super hot days, and we broke temperature records all across the U.S. that year. And so that was a good example of a year where you actually saw some actual weather affected by climate change. So it's more complex, but of course he only has 60 minutes or less than that to convey these complex concepts.
Well, yeah, I think, and again, this has been a running challenge for Cosmos, because of the kinds of ambitions, because of these big sort of social and philosophical messages that it's been focusing on, rather than so much the specifics of recent astronomical research. Neil Tyson and Andrew and Steve Soder, the creators of the show, have really they've taken on these big challenges, and I think a lot of the concerns that we've raised over the course of these hangouts, where they've developed sometimes radically simplified historical narratives and picked out individual people as heroes. And I think in this episode, simplified and maybe even slightly overstated certain aspects of how the science works. I think that's the challenge of in the span of, as you say, it's probably 46 minutes of actual television time. to try to present a big argument, and to try to present it in a coherent way when there are a lot of loose ends. When, as you say, there are a lot of complexities about the climate models, and about heat sinks, and about the circulation of the deep ocean, and about exactly sort of how these things play together. If you want to be a climate scientist, you need to understand all those things. And at the same time, there's a sort of a higher level message, which is that there is a relatively high level of predictability to climate compared to the relatively low predictability of what the weather will be like in, say, 2 weeks, and that's it's a confusing idea to many people, but it's absolutely crucial to understanding why scientists feel able to make these predictions.
It's kind of like flipping a coin or rolling a dice. You may not know if it's going to come up snake eyes or not, but if you do it 5,000 times, you're going to get 12 or 2 with a certain amount of frequency. So it's very similar to that kind of thing.
So what do you do? We live in a world where science is showing that we have a global warming issue. We know that there's a vast amount of carbon dioxide gas being expelled into the atmosphere through our presence on the planet now. The planet doesn't care, but for us, ultimately, it's going to be a big problem unless we turn things around. Now, why is it that so few people will understand this who are not scientifically plugged in, or even politically forcefully resist the information that we've gathered scientifically? And B, why is it as a species that we need to have this, as we mentioned, the Apollo program was a political space race built on fear and being number one, and my rocket's bigger than your rocket. Why do we have to have this gimmick to attach something to? Why can't we as a species identify that there's something that's crucially important for our future and do what's right without having this sort of gimmick to ride along on? Isn't that an incredible thing at this point? I mean, there are some reasonably smart people on this planet, and yet we're sort of sociologically and politically and societally set up in this kind of really restricted, amazingly amateurish thought process. What can we really do about that? We don't have a political race against another nation now to take care of this problem.
Well, I think you actually. Oh, sorry, April, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to quickly say, well, we don't have a monster to fight. Like we were saying before, it's something that's largely invisible, even though we're starting to see the effects. We're not seeing the hugest impacts yet, and I think we're a crisis. We've become a crisis response society, or maybe we always have been. So it took, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire decades ago for the Clean Water Act to be passed, and similar catastrophes for pretty much every environmental law we have now. The loss of endangered species leading to the Endangered Species Act. But in this case, there's no smoking gun really to point at, and so I think that's part of what makes it more difficult to get people behind the policy changes we need to make, and also the economic impact. Even though there's going to be huge economic consequences of climate change, a lot of people in the fossil fuel industry especially are focused on the economic impact of actually doing something. So there's also these countervailing forces at work against actually taking action. And denial, I think it's hard for people to, it's such a huge thing, and there's so many dire predictions that I think it's really hard for people to wrap their heads around, first of all. And secondly, it's just so depressing that I think psychologically people might just shut off. They just don't want to think about it. So that makes it hard to rally people behind some sort of action and supporting policy changes too.
Well, and we've got a tough job. I mean, it's just to interject very quickly here. I mean, when this is a huge single system experiment that's going forward now, and when it does become obvious to the naysayers, it might be too late to do much of anything about it on a large scale. So that's one significant danger. The other problem that we're hamstrung with, of course, certainly on Capitol Hill here and in other nations too, is that the people in charge of the laws have a sort of long-term vision of about 12 and a half minutes that may extend perhaps to the next election. But the long-term vision of what's good for the people on this planet is not so much part of the political process, you could argue, anymore, as maybe it was 100 or 200 years ago in this country. And that really limits us, I think, in terms of doing what's right on this issue as well.
Well, I think, Dave, I mean, you sort of framed this briefly in evolutionary terms, and I think evolutionary terms is actually a good way to think about it. The idea of of an entire species that thinks about its long-term survival and that thinks globally, we're not like any other species on this planet, and yet we are still we're a product of evolution, and we're in some sense our psychology is limited by where we came from and what we evolved from. This idea of essentially transcending evolution, of thinking about our long-term survival, taking it into our own control, thinking globally rather than individually. I mean, I think that's a very difficult thing. It does require getting past that sort of personal survival instinct. I think for a lot of people, the individualism is at the heart of a lot of denialism. People don't like the idea that government is going to take control and take control away from me. They have a hard time wrapping their head around the idea of a problem that is global in scale and that unfolds over decades and centuries in ways that are hard to perceive. I mean, in many ways, global warming is kind of like is the perfect kind of problem that works against human psychology and I guess the human evolutionary tendencies. So I think the challenge here is how great can we be as a species? Are we really what we claim to be? A species that has sort of transcended its animal nature and is able to take responsibility for its own actions. I think April touched on a very important point, which is that people respond to catastrophe and to individual narratives. And honestly, I think that is how a lot of things are going to move. I think it's going to be with things like Hurricane Sandy, and it's going to be with things like unfortunately there's going to be some really bad flooding event in a place like Bangladesh. There are going to be some, you're seeing right now extreme drought going on in the United States, and quite possibly you're going to see something quite a bit worse than that unfolding over the next few years. I think what's going to happen is you're going to start to see events that are wake-up events. And I think what you're also going to see is there's a nascent but fast-growing environmental movement in China, and I think that may be another thing that really moves the needle is when Americans see that this nation that they think of as their ruthless competitor that doesn't worry about all the niceties that we worry about, that all of a sudden we see that they are worrying about these things. I suspect that that's going to have a significant psychological effect.
Agree completely. Yep. Now let's quickly go to a Twitter question we have. What technologies are available or soon to be available that will allow a personal effort toward fighting global warming?
Well, we already have solar panels, and even though they're still pretty pricey, I've actually looked into them for the house. I just moved from Santa Fe, and I own a house there, and I looked into it. Obviously, lots of sun in Santa Fe, not so much here in Milwaukee, but solar panels are pretty effective pretty much anywhere at this point. They've evolved a lot. But my point is, they're still expensive, but they are out there, and there's some really nice subsidies, federal and state subsidies, depending on what state you live in, that can defray the cost of those. And there's even some, there's some new wind power developments too that you can tap into. If you call your local power company, you can find out if they do buy wind power or solar power. And a lot of utilities allow you to opt into getting a certain percentage of your electricity from renewable sources, so you can support it that way. And then also, transportation is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. So most people have probably heard this, and it's pretty simple, but it's one of the most, I think, beneficial things you can do. Walk as much as you can, or take public transportation, basically anything that allows you to drive less.
I mean, there's another thing, personal thing that people can do that is incredibly powerful. It's one word, and it's vote. I think there are, on the one hand, I think it's important that people feel personally invested in conservation efforts, in buying a fuel-efficient car, in using mass transit, in switching to energy-efficient light bulbs, and doing all the different things. As you said, switching to green electricity if that's available where you live. I mean, there are a lot of different things you can do on the personal level, but supporting policies and voting for politicians who acknowledge what's going on and who can help influence things like regulating carbon power plants and supporting these first incremental efforts to cut America's overall carbon emissions, to invest money into new energy technologies. Supporting those policies and supporting the politicians who support those policies, that's huge, and that is fundamentally, it's a collection of a large number of individuals, like all these other things, just like conservation, just like everything else. The individual vote is an incredibly powerful way that one person can make a difference.
Yeah, Corey, I'm really glad you brought up the new carbon limits, and we should probably just make clear that what you were referring to there are brand new, freshly unveiled just the other day, rules that will limit carbon dioxide pollution and actually other greenhouse gases too from power plants. I think cutting them 30% below 2005 emission levels.
Right, by 2030.
That's a pretty huge step, especially in the current political climate, so to speak, in Washington. You just had Mark Rubio, a pretty outspoken and well-known Republican climate naysayer, coming out against these rules. So that's one thing that that politicians are doing right now. Those new rules are a good example of what I think we need to be doing. And there's also new fuel efficiency regulations that are coming out in phases over the years. So there are some things going on, but of course this is a global problem, so it needs to have a global solution. And we have these regular global meetings of top emitting nations, including the U.S., and not much gets done. So yeah, I really appreciate Corey's point that we need to get involved and we need to vote. And I would also add, make sure you're well informed. A good place to start would be the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report that just recently came out, along with the U.S. climate assessment that just came out last month. And there's actually pretty digestible summaries of those. It's pretty dry reading, but it's pretty accessible. So that would be one way to get better informed, because I think there's a lot of conflicting messages out there, and I think it's hard for people to parse those. And I think it's a great idea to go straight to the source and see what the scientists are actually saying. And the IPCC U.S. climate assessment were written by some of the top climate scientists in the world, and as far as the U.S. assessment goes in this country. So why not see exactly what the scientists are saying before you believe what some politician with no science background is saying.
And not to be too snarky, but another thing that people can do to limit individually what they're doing is not fly to the White Cliffs of Dover or to the Arctic Circle to television shows.
Wow.
Yeah, to film that episode. Maybe he bought climate emission offsets. You can do that. That's another thing that individuals can do.
But you can buy the offsets and not fly.
Maybe he sailed. We don't know.
I think I did recognize that beach as the one that Tiktaalik climbed up on in a previous episode. So I think maybe they were getting efficiencies of scale. Maybe
it was all done green screen. Maybe it all happened at a back lot in Queens.
Well, I would hope so. That would be one way.
Well, look, there's another important point here, which is, regardless of what we do at this point, even if we seriously curtail future carbon emissions, we're already in a warming trend. There's a certain amount of warming that's already underway, and so there's also there's going to be a need for adaptation along with emissions reductions, and that adds another layer of complexity to the message, which is that you need to be doing these things hand in hand. And again, I think there could be a positive effect there. Back to that, Apollo program, the Apollo moon landing kind of idea that this episode of Cosmos made. Doing major adaptation programs, major irrigation projects to deal with drought, major flood control problems for flood control measures for coastal areas. Those are going to be big, expensive, difficult projects. And I think as people start to see the cost of doing those things, the difficulty of doing those things, and the engineering challenges and the budget implications of them, I think that also is going to drive home that there really is a cost benefit here. That people focus heavily on the cost of cutting emissions and what will this do to the economy? Well, you look at the cost of what is it going to cost to do a transcontinental irrigation project, or what would it cost just to build seawalls around New York City? Forget New York City. Think about Florida. Think about where Marco Rubio is. Think about what a foot of sea level rise would mean for Florida and for storm surges. These things are going to be happening hand in hand, and I think more and more you're going to see a dialogue going on between those two sides. That as the cost of adaptation becomes clear, the benefits of emissions cuts and long-term thinking are also going to become clearer.
Unfortunately, we're not going to see the worst effects for some time, though, like we were saying before. So I think it's really hard. I hope that happens, that Marco Rubio will wake up and say, hey, I'm from a state that's going to be one of the hardest hit areas of the country, and actually do something to help his citizenry. But the fact is that, like you were saying, we have a hard time thinking long term, and so I think it might be difficult for people to invest now to protect ourselves from something that's going to happen down the line, even if we are seeing some of these major impacts already.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about one of the questions that came in was having to do with oceans. When you look at the sheer numbers of molecules that are good at heat exchange on this planet, all that dihydrogen oxide in the oceans, really efficient at it. So what are the effects of oceans? We know a lot of this warmth is stored in the oceans. So what are the effects on the oceans of global warming, and what's happening with them now, and how are they likely to affect the future as more carbon dioxide gets pumped into the atmosphere?
Well, heat makes ocean water expand, and so that's why you have sea level rise. And I think the predictions are that it's going to rise globally 2 to 7 feet, depending on the emissions scenario. Depending on what we do or don't do, is my understanding. And the oceans are becoming more acidic. They've become about 30% more acidic so far. And what happens is shellfish like oysters, crabs, corals, and corals. It has a corrosive effect on them, so it's affecting marine organisms already. We're seeing coral bleaching, coral reefs dying off. So there's all kinds of effects on the ocean, which I believe is the greatest carbon sink. And so that's a huge, and I actually thought that was kind of overlooked in Sunday night's episode. It was just briefly touched upon, and I was kind of surprised by that. But then again, as we were saying earlier, there's so much to pack into one episode.
Right, and the oceans are also, they're one of the big unknowns. Modeling ocean circulation, modeling how much carbon dioxide they can absorb, and how ocean circulation changes with changes in heat inputs. That's a very, very complicated process. And again, looking back to history for guidance is somewhat limited, because the speed at which things are happening right now is markedly different than the normal rate of geological change. So even though obviously there have been periods of time when Earth was warmer, there have been periods of time when the carbon dioxide levels were higher than they are today, when you look back at in the historical record, you see things that changed over millions of years, or even in periods of rapid change over thousands of years. Here we're looking at things that are changing over decades, and so that's one of the reasons that they're hard to model, is because you don't really have much to look back to. Even understanding how much carbon dioxide goes into the oceans, and how much heat is being absorbed into the ocean, and how much, this kind of flattening out of the warming trend that's going on right now, that a lot of the global warming skeptics have focused on. It's pretty clear that part of what's going on right now is that more heat is going to the ocean and less is going to the atmosphere. But exactly how that works, and exactly when that will flip back, it's a very difficult thing to understand, because you have El Nino and La Nina and all these other short-term patterns impressed on top of it. So I think this gets back to this big idea, which is right now we're running an experiment that we really only understand in the broadest outlines of what its outcome is going to be. That experiment is the way we live. We've built our cities and built our agriculture and done everything around one exact climate for this planet, and we're running an experiment now of, well, if we create a different climate, how will we do? That's a pretty risky experiment to run.
Right, we're experimenting on ourselves.
With no basis of prior information with which to compare.
Except Venus, if you take this episode at its word.
Rich, do you want to say anything about what we don't know about early Venusian history?
Well, I'll just go into it a little bit. You talked about it in the sense that they had a global resurfacing probably 500 to 750 million years ago. And as Neil mentioned, the Venera spacecraft that actually landed on the surface didn't last very long, so we don't really have any good observations of what the surface is like in terms of its elemental composition. So it's really hard to get at what happened on Earth, on Venus early on. There may well have been global oceans, but kind of the interesting fact that Neil didn't mention, and I understand why, is that assuming there were oceans on the early Venus, the greenhouse gas that had the most effect was water vapor and not carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide there now is what keeps the greenhouse going, but the disappearing of the oceans on Venus was almost entirely driven by the vaporization of the water in the oceans and going into the atmosphere. And water vapor is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So I can understand why Neil didn't want to get into that too much, because it doesn't quite parallel the experience here on Earth with increasing carbon dioxide, but that's what the situation is.
Well, I'd like to put in a plug here for a mission back to Venus, because there are some really interesting proposals. There's a proposal called the Venus Land Sailing Rover. It would be a rover that's capable of withstanding the 900 or so degree Fahrenheit surface temperatures of Venus, the incredibly high the 90 bar atmospheric pressure. It would be a rover that could explore the surface of Venus and could do several very interesting things. It could tell you about the history of Venus, about the current geology of Venus. It could even maybe do some prospecting to see if there really was a habitable period, if there really was a possibility of life on early Venus. And it would also, interestingly, tell you a lot about the formation of the Earth and the formation of the Moon by understanding the chemical differences between our planet and Venus. It would be not a cheap mission, but compared to some of the other grand things that we do, not an incredibly expensive thing. I think Venus is a really, really interesting place. It's this twin of Earth in so many ways, and yet totally different. And understanding why that is, I think we would learn some really fascinating things that might have practical implications and would certainly have phenomenal scientific implications. I mean, here you have Venus, which is the exact same size as the Earth, give or take. It's a similar distance from the Sun, and yet it does not have plate tectonics. It does not have a strong geomagnetic field. It obviously has a radically different climate. It didn't end up with oceans. What happened? And as you say, this episode of Cosmos presents one interesting idea of what early Venus was like, but the truth is, we don't know. Very early in the solar system, the Sun was weaker, cooler than it is now, and if you go back and sort of think about what conditions were like 4 billion years ago, well, in principle, Venus actually looks like a better place for life to have gotten started than Earth. The temperatures there were probably more favorable. What happened? Why was Earth habitable? Why did Venus go wrong? I think if you want to understand the origin of life, again, Venus is a great place to go looking. That's my 2 cents.
I couldn't agree more. Yes, we do need another Venus mission. Absolutely.
Plus the technology problem of building a 900-degree rover. Talk about an interesting engineering challenge. That is a really amazing engineering challenge. I visited Honeybee Robotics in New York City recently, where they developed some of the systems for the Mars rovers, and they actually have prototypes of engines and motors and treads and things that you would need for building a Venus rover. The basic technology is out there, and that would probably be really useful technology for high temperature engines, for interesting industrial applications as well.
And for the future of our cars on Earth.
Yes.
Continue to warm. This isn't totally related to Venus, but it is one thought that came up when we were talking about kind of predicting the future of climate and why climate change is such a hard problem. And part of it that we did discuss, and I think this is a big proportion, is the psychology of climate change and the scale and kind of conceiving of a global population when, psychological studies have shown that our minds are built to conceive of maybe a few hundred people at most, sort of the size of a village, and so population is one aspect of it. But I think another really interesting part of the climate problem in studying climate change that the episode only just really quickly touched on is the mechanism of the problem itself, that there are so many feedback loops within climate, and Corey talked about the oceans and the uncertainty of how they'll respond, but there are just so many, if you dig into the science of climate change, there are so many intricate kind of arrows back when you look at one thing and how it might act on another thing, and I think that speaks to, as April was saying, the challenge that models are faced with, and obviously a lot of unknowns, because we've determined that Venus can't be our stand-in terms of seeing how this all will play out. But yeah, we only talked about it really briefly in the episode. When he talked about thawing the permafrost, he talked about how it was a positive feedback mechanism. But the question marks that hover over how clouds respond and how the deep oceans respond and how rock weathering responds, and all of that is kind of really knotted together in a really, troubling but sort of scientifically really fascinating way. So that's my 2 cents.
That's a good point. And even though there's climate models, climate scientists always talk about projections. There's a reason that they never say predictions when they're talking about future climate and models, because models can only project, they can't predict. But even though there's still some uncertainty in the models, and probably always will be, I think it's important to reiterate to people that the trends are not uncertain, and we're becoming even more and more confident about those trends as time goes on and we refine the models. Like, you can look at, we've been measuring temperature since the 1800s now, and if you look at that temperature data and compare it to how the climate has actually changed in that same time period, it lines up pretty well. So, I think it's a powerful argument that we're onto something here for sure, and we should be taking action, and that coupled with the changes we're already seeing, yes, there is uncertainty with how the oceans are responding, but we've already seen, I think, 8 inches of sea level rise on average globally, and island nations are the best place to look at that. I mean, Palau and the Marshall Islands, they're really scared of what's happening, and I know in Fiji they're actually moving people to higher ground. I mean, this is really real and in the here and now for some people. Unfortunately, they're in these tiny countries or territories, and they don't have a political voice. And they've actually approached, our government and other governments of major emitting countries and said, look, this is real. This is really happening to us. This is a huge issue. We're having to move people, and in some places they're actually planning to abandon the entire group of islands and move to another country. And so you also have security issues. What's going to happen when, like, the population of Bangladesh, for instance, has to move to another country? Where are those people going to go? That could result in increased conflict, and that's a whole area that social scientists are studying. That's pretty frightening, but also, pretty important to look at, I think.
And of course, some of the earliest places of ground zero, if you will, in this issue are socioeconomically poor places where there's, you don't have necessarily all the resources to throw at a problem like that to help out as much as you could in other places. But what do you say? All these things are linked. You made some awesome points in the last 10 minutes here, all of you. These things are all linked. We talked about, for example, one little thing, the permafrost thawing and the decomposition of it and how that contributes further to the whole process. And turning that around is very difficult. Now, what do you say to someone who doesn't live on the coast somewhere and who think, well, this is all part of the natural cycle, and the cycle will come back and we'll have ice ages again because we know that we're in an interglacial period. So what is despite our factories and carbon dioxide, it's all an exaggeration, isn't it really? What do you say to those people?
Well, I think, look, I think this episode of Cosmos was very much constructed with those people in mind. I think, I think that was what the writers and Neil Tyson were trying to do. Is there's some people who are just ideologically or personally resistant to accepting the idea of global warming. And there's some people who's you're just never going to change their minds, or you're not going to change their minds with anything less than with radical events happening in the world. But I think
they're holding onto a raft floating out into the Gulf away from New Orleans. Then
right.
They might change. Yeah. Right.
But I think there's a large group in the middle which I think is genuinely conflicted. I think I think they take the evidence seriously, but there are the same people who, when there's a very cold winter, they start to think, well, maybe this whole thing was exaggerated, or maybe the whole thing was a mistake. I mean, I think they're people who are. It's not that they're ignorant, but it's that they're not really clued into what the evidence is and how to interpret it. So I mean, I think they're people who sway back and forth. I think that's really who the show is aimed at. Because you don't need to convince 99% of the public. You need to convince, I would say, 51% of the public, or maybe 60% of the public, to really to look at this in a thoughtful, open-minded way, and to look. I mean, we're asking people to think like scientists, and that's not the way that a lot of people are trained to think. That's not the way that a lot of people normally live their lives, is to look at issues in a global context, and to look at the difference between daily scales and century scales of how the planet operates. I mean, that is a somewhat ambitious thing to ask of people, and I think so it's not surprising that you don't change hearts and minds overnight, but I think there's a hardcore that you're never going to reach. I think there are people who just for hard ideological reasons just do not want to believe that this is true, and I think trying to present them with evidence and change every single mind is a thankless task. But I think like I said, I think there's a large sensible middle who they want to live comfortably, they want the economy to be good, they don't want to destroy the planet. They worry about their children and their grandchildren, and if you can really show them that this is how you need to think about it, when you think about it, the evidence is really clear, and there actually is a path forward that you can do things. You can do things personally, you can do things politically. that there is that there is a course of action here. I think that we just have to keep hitting that narrative, and I think then and that's when it comes back to this thing of of who we vote for and how scientists express themselves, and the fact that scientists do need to step forward and talk about what they're doing. I think scientists get caricatured all the time as people who are they're just chasing grant money, or or they're bossy know-it-alls who just kind of want to tell other people how to live their lives. And if you actually meet these climate scientists, you actually talk to these climate scientists, my God, if these people want to get rich, this is not how you get rich. If you want to be powerful, this is not the way you would go about being powerful. These are people who they're phenomenally interested in understanding how things work, and they are phenomenally concerned about making the planet a better place. And I think we just need to get those voices out.
Any other final thoughts, Lisa? Sorry.
I was just going to say, yeah, I think there's a lot of hope in that. I think people are basically, for the most part, reasonable and want to do the right thing. And so I think, if you can find a way to get them the facts and to offer them some hope. And I think this Cosmos episode was a really great way to communicate to segments of society that may not be that well informed about this yet. People who may have a casual interest in science, but may not know that much about climate science. I know people of all walks of life have been watching this show, which is great. It is an opportunity to educate people who are a little bit outside the choir. So I think that's a good thing.
Lisa?
And we should send a mission to Venus. Not necessarily because that'll do anything about global warming, but it would be really cool.
Corey, one grand challenge at a time, all right? Sorry, Rich, what were you going to say?
Oh, no, I was just saying it would be really cool in a hot kind of way if you were going to. Yeah, no, I think this episode really wrapped up the ideas behind global warming really well. Neil touched on it a few times in earlier episodes, but didn't go into the detail that he managed to get into here. So I think it was a really good way of getting those people who may not be as science nerdy as many of us are interested in it and seeing what the different possibilities are. And as we've all said, giving us a look at a hopeful future instead of the dire future that a lot of people kind of, I think that may in fact be part of the problem, is that some of the predictions are so dire and are happening so soon that there's not really anything we can do about it. Neil certainly gave us the option of thinking about ways that we can do it and that it's not too late. So I think that's an excellent point to make.
And there's an interesting sort of closure here with the show, because Carl Sagan was one of the first people to actually talk about global warming and warn people what was coming years ago. And I think he mentioned climate change on his original show. So it's kind of cool to see Neil deGrasse Tyson taking up that mantle and doing a whole show about it when now that it's his turn to do Cosmos.
Yeah. And actually, sorry, I just want to Lisa, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Go ahead. Go say what you're gonna say. Mine's different.
I was particularly struck by that. First of all, because Carl Sagan was a very early person, talking about climate change and specifically about the role of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in climate change. And also, there's this ongoing low-level narrative among the global warming skeptics that well, in the 70s, everyone said that global cooling was coming, that we were entering another ice age. And in fact, if you look back in the literature, no, there were plenty of people who were, there was a perfectly clear understanding of the effect of greenhouse gases. People just weren't sure what the predominant trends were going to be. And so I thought there was a really neat little bit, it kind of flew by in the episode, in which the show ran an image of Carl Sagan's paper from, I think, 1964, when he was talking about greenhouse gases and their potential impact on the environment, not just on Venus, but on the Earth as well. And the fact that in the original Cosmos in 1980, at a time when, if you believe this narrative, scientists were still telling us about global cooling, Carl Sagan was talking about global warming. It's one of the most mystifying things because it's history. You can actually go back and see, well, what were people actually saying? And the fact is, they were not saying we're entering another ice age. You follow these stories, and the thread always goes back to one article from 1976 in Newsweek, which, boy, I wouldn't want to be responsible for, trying to pin the entire belief of the world's scientists over 20 years in what one news reporter wrote in one article.
Seems like it goes back to science education, too. What do you guys think of that? I mean, it's occurred to me that part of the reason that people have a hard time believing this stuff and they're so vulnerable to those inaccurate messages is because they aren't well educated enough about basic science or even how to go about understanding science.
That's unfortunately absolutely true. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think again, I think it breaks into two camps. I think there are people who are perfectly well educated about science, but have a mental block about certain things that they just don't like to be true. But I think there's the large, sensible middle where you're right, where we're presenting people, not just hitting them over the head with evidence, but actually talking to them about the process and the personal stories of the people who are doing this work and helping them understand why they're doing this research and how they're doing this research. I think again, personalizing it and clarifying the process of how this research is actually done. I think there's a lot of room there because you can see studies that just hitting people over the head with fact after fact after fact tends not to be a very effective technique. But I think if you explain more of the process, especially as you say, getting people earlier in life to think about living life like a curious scientist, of always looking, starting with the question of I wonder what's going on, rather than with the assumption of I know what the answer is. If you can get just a few more people thinking that way, I think the impact could be huge.
Well, and it was Carl who said, in fact, that when we were all 5 years old, every one of us was a scientist, and so it's keeping that sense of curiosity and wonder and imagining how things work in the universe and caring about it throughout those teenage years and beyond is in our American educational system and elsewhere is the challenge, of course. And I'm afraid to say, but that's all the time that we have for today. Thanks to the panelists for a great discussion as always, fabulous today. And a special thanks to Celestron for sponsoring this Cosmos Rewind Google Hangout. As the series wraps up, Astronomy Magazine and Celestron are sponsoring a special contest to those who have enjoyed Cosmos. Through the end of June, just share with us what the series has meant to you, and you'll be entered for a chance to win a Celestron Cosmos 90 GT Wi-Fi telescope. This is a nice scope. Enter today at astronomy.com. We'll be back next week to discuss the final episode of Cosmos titled, Unafraid of the Dark. That sounds like it'll be an adventure. We hope that you can join us next week. Thanks again to all of the panelists for a great, great job today, and we will see you in a week.
All right. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks.